Just waiting for a few more people to come on. But I want to start with good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're calling from. I'm Dr Ercoli, and I'm here today with Gary Small from the UCLA Center on Aging. And Dr. Small and I are going to have a conversation about innovative brain imaging for the early detection of neurodegeneration. And this is a really important topic about potential ways to identify neurodegeneration in the brain early with the goal of getting people enrolled in clinical trials for treatments. And so without further ado, I'll start right now. And it's important to provide a little bit of background for this talk. Let's first of all talk about age. So age is the single greatest risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease. By age 85, an individual's risk approaches 50%. And each year, about 50 million people suffer from some type of traumatic brain injury, which is another type of neurodegeneration. And they suffer falls from this type of traumatic brain injury damage due to instability of gait. And this in particular puts older adults at additional risk for more traumatic brain injury. So these age-related risks can lead to two forms of neurodegeneration that share an underlying brain pathology, including amyloid plaques and tau tangles. The accumulation of these abnormal brain proteins define Alzheimer's disease, and tau tangles are the predominant feature of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or called CTE, which results from head trauma. Our UCLA research has discovered an innovative technology called FDDNP-PET imaging, which is the only brain scan method that can detect both amyloid and tau in the brains of living people. So our initial studies showed that this method can identify and differentiate Alzheimer's disease and CTE early in their course, and also predict which people will go on to develop dementia. So in this webinar, we're going to describe exciting research in this area and the current opportunity to accelerate the research so we can identify and treat patients with Alzheimer's disease early in their course and direct patients with CTE into clinical trials of novel treatments of this disease. So, Gary, want to introduce Dr. Gary Small.
Thank you, Linda. It's a delight to be joining all of you this evening. I think a lot of you know me because I've been directing the Longevity Center for quite a few years. As many of you probably know, I'm retiring from UCLA at the end of the month. Somebody in New Jersey made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and I will be leading behavioral health at the major health system in New Jersey. I'm very excited about that, but very sad to leave UCLA, and I'm very grateful to all of you who've supported the center over the many years I've been directing. I am really grateful to Dr. Linda Ercoli for agreeing to serve as the interim director of the Longevity Center. I think she's going to do a tremendous job. She has been very involved in the development of our memory education programs over the years. She understands how the center operates. And I think she's going to be tremendous in bringing it to the next level. I know that the internet connections are a bit choppy. I'm not quite sure why, but I'll do my best in trying to communicate this evening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be talking about a group of studies that we've been doing. And it's a real opportunity to move this technology forward, to really help a tremendous number of people both those at risk for Alzheimer's disease and those at risk for a condition called chronic traumatic encephalopathy that results from multiple head traumas. You probably heard a lot about that in the news because of some of the famous football players who have suffered from this condition. And I'm going to tell you about what we've done so far in this area and what we can do in the future. And I'm going to also appeal to you for your help. Many of you have supported the Longevity Center over the years, and here's another opportunity to support us, but really put that money in an area that will help a tremendous number of people, many of them who are close to you in your own orbits, who have been suffering from these various conditions. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to share my screen, and I will pull up my PowerPoint and tell you about this really exciting area of research. So we're going to be talking about a form of technology called PET scanning, and the shorthand for it is FDDNP, and it's able to detect abnormal protein deposits in the brain called amyloid, plaques, and tangles. And we think that this is going to be very effective in identifying people with problems early on, so we can intervene early and protect a healthy brain before there's tremendous damage. Here I've listed some of our major collaborators, not all of them. You notice that Dr. Ercoli is prominent in that list. She's been very involved in our studies. You may recognize some of the other people. For example, Bennett Omalu, if you saw the movie Concussion, that was based on his life. Will Smith played Bennett in that film. And it was about how he discovered the link between this condition, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and head trauma in national football players. So why are we talking about this? Well, there are a lot of risk factors for neurodegeneration, but as Dr. Ercoli mentioned, age is the major risk factor for developing dementia of Alzheimer's disease. By age 65 or older, the risk is about 10%. By age 85 or older, it approaches 45%. The Alzheimer's Association came out with a statistic that every 69 or 70 seconds, another American is diagnosed with Alzheimer's. But we have another major risk factor for brain degeneration, and that's traumatic brain injury. 1.7 million Americans are affected each year. When I mentioned football players, they suffer as many as 1.6 to 3.8 million concussions each year. So this is a big problem. It's not just football players. Older people like this. Falls are a big problem for head trauma. And about 28% of the causes of traumatic brain injuries are falls. And you know that as people get older, they are at greater risk for falls. So here we see some information about what we call mild traumatic brain injury and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. These repeated traumas to the brain may cause a constellation of symptoms: chronic mood, behavioral, cognitive, and even motor disturbances. Now, the diagnosis of this condition at this point can only be confirmed at autopsy, where we see these predominantly abnormal tau deposits in areas of the brain, in the medial temporal region, underneath the temples, and deep within the brain, what we call subcortical structures. And here's some images showing you where the dark area pointing to the amygdala shows you high concentration of tau abnormalities in this brain region of autism in the patient who had chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Now keep in mind, the amygdala is the emotional brain. That's the area of the brain that controls our mood. We see comorbidity with Alzheimer's disease and frontal lobe dementia and other neurodegenerative diseases. So people who get these repeated head traumas will have a constellation of cognitive and mood symptoms. With Alzheimer's disease, we see some similar abnormalities. I mentioned the risk according to age. We also see mood and behavioral changes. They're not as predominant early on in the disease, but you see the tau tangles and amyloid plaques. And let me mention that you do get amyloid plaques in CTE as well as in Alzheimer's disease. Just that the tau proteins are more predominant in CTE. And there are a number of links between these two conditions. There have been several studies of NFL players, and they find that the risk of mood and cognitive changes in these retired players is greater if they've had 3 or more concussions. NFL players also have a 4-fold increased risk of dying from Alzheimer's disease. Now, independent of being a football player, we've known for many years that if you hit your head and you lose consciousness for an hour or more, that doubles your risk for Alzheimer's disease. And if you also have the APOE4 genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease and that kind of head trauma, you have a 10-fold risk for Alzheimer's disease. Another tie between these two conditions is that there's evidence of heightened brain inflammation in both CTE and Alzheimer's. That may be a common link. Now, why should we develop a brain imaging tool to detect and differentiate Alzheimer's disease and CTE? As I mentioned, both conditions have similar clinical presentations, cognitive, mood, and behavioral symptoms. If we could differentiate these two conditions early on, it would clarify how to get people on the right treatment. Right now, we do have treatments for Alzheimer's disease, but there is no treatment for chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Nothing's been proved. And the current methods that we have are limited. A method that we've studied for many years is another form of PET scanning called FDG-PET. And instead of showing the amyloid plaques and tau tangles, it shows you how the brain metabolizes or uses sugar. And this reflects how the brain cells are communicating. And that's somewhat of a general phenomenon. It may not be specific. On the other hand, there are brain scans, PET brain scans, that just look at amyloid. And we think that's too specific because it doesn't measure tau. And there are brain scans that just look at tau, but those are too early in development. And we need something that, I think that would measure both the amyloid and the tau to give you a broader picture of what's going on in the brain. So here are some studies that our group did early on. This is actually published in New England Journal of Medicine. And it shows you what these brain scans look like, these FDDNP-PET scans. This is people with age-related memory loss and Alzheimer's disease. So in panel A, you see people who didn't have any cognitive problems at baseline and after 2 years of follow-up. You see the brain is healthy and blue. But in the middle panel, you see someone who has mild cognitive impairment at baseline. And that's a condition that puts a person at risk for Alzheimer's disease. And you see already mild cognitive impairment in these areas of the brain, it's already beginning to get yellow. This is the medial temporal region where the hippocampus is, a very important brain memory center. We followed this person for 2 years, and the person developed Alzheimer's disease. You see there's much more amyloid and tau in the brain. This third person had Alzheimer's disease when we first studied them with the brain PET scan. And we followed that person. After a year, that individual passed away. And we did autopsy studies. And you can see the areas of the brain, lateral temporal and medial temporal region, where there was a lot of signal showing amyloid plaques and tau tangles. At autopsy, you saw a high concentration of these abnormal protein deposits. Now, we've done extensive studies over the years, and here you see an animation that plots 20 scans on a three-dimensional plot of the brain. And as the memory score gets worse, you see there's more red and yellow in the brain. These are the areas where the plaques and tangles build up. But here, as the animation goes around, these people, you can begin to see the subtle evidence of plaques and tangles. And early on, we can detect this 20 years before people actually get dementia or it interferes with their everyday life. Now, here's an animation that came from the New England Journal of Medicine article. Let's see if this works. It shows you what happens when somebody on the football field gets tackled. Let's see if this works. Well, maybe it's not showing it. So trust me, it will show you that as the head moves forward, it causes problems in the deep part of the brain. Think of it this way. If you're in the car and you're going 10 miles per hour and a pedestrian darts out in front of your car and you have to stop short, you're going to feel that seatbelt against your chest. And that's kind of what happens when somebody is tackled on a football field. You know, they may not have a concussion, but they sort of stop short and the brain kind of gets rattled around. Imagine if you stop short 100 times. You're going to have a bruise on your chest from that seatbelt. And that's what's going on from these mild traumatic brain injuries. Now, a number of years ago, we did our first study looking at NFL retirees. And these are some images from our article on that first study. And it shows you a pattern that is a bit different from Alzheimer's disease, a little bit similar, but it differs in several ways. And you have just 5 football players at that point. But look at what's going on. If you look at this pattern, here's a good way to look at it. You can see this is the amygdala, and this is the midbrain. It's almost like a triangle of tau that's being deposited. And we've seen this. We've done more studies over the years. We see this pattern in every single subject that we've studied so far. And the control, you see, doesn't have that kind of thing. We find that when there's more cognitive impairment, more behavioral problems, you can almost stage the degree of CTE. And you see that same pattern in CTE4, very obvious, with the amygdala and the midbrain hotspots. And if you compare that to Alzheimer's disease, you don't see, here's the NFL player, it's red means more amyloid and tau, yellow means a bit less, and you can see, you know, in Alzheimer's disease, you have more of this. But look, a few years ago, we looked at military personnel. Most people are experiencing different kinds of brain injuries, what we call blast injuries, from these devices that explode. Same pattern, not quite as severe, but the amygdala and the midbrain. And here's just a summary of what you see and why we think this is important. We have a single measure of both amyloid and tau. And it's ideal for differentiating these conditions. So even though tau deposition is necessary to confirm a CTE diagnosis, you see amyloid in about 40% of cases. Both tau and amyloid are necessary to diagnose Alzheimer's disease. And the available data indicate that the pattern of tau and amyloid deposition is more important than targeting the individual protein. It's really, my colleague George Barrio talks about this. It's a bit like real estate. What are the three most important things about real estate? Location, location, location. Same is true about this kind of imaging. Pattern of deposition is what tells the story. So let me just summarize what we've found so far. We've done multiple studies on this in high impact journals. It's had a huge international impact, what we found. Let's put UCLA on the map. I mean, it was already on the map in terms of brain imaging. A huge impact in terms of the science. We've been able to show that we can differentiate Alzheimer's disease from mild cognitive impairment. We've shown that this technology has predictive value. That in people with mild cognitive impairment, this risk state for Alzheimer's disease, we see a pattern that will predict who will get dementia in 2 years. We looked at other forms of neurodegeneration like pure tauopathies, a condition called progressive supranuclear palsy, which is all tau. And we find that the pattern is completely consistent with what's seen on autopsy. I shared with you those initial reports we did on the patterns in retired football players. Our reports have shown high binding patterns that differentiate not only AD from suspected CTE, but we've also shown the same pattern in military personnel who've had blast injuries. So what this led to was an appeal to the FDA. And I got to tell you, the FDA committee was extremely enthusiastic about this technology, not just in identifying CTE, but also as a predictive test for Alzheimer's disease. So they, after several meetings with the FDA, we came up with this study design. And here's what we need to do. We need to recruit 180 volunteers with mild cognitive impairment, this risk state for Alzheimer's. So some of you may have heard about this condition. It's basically a memory or other cognitive loss that is affecting people's lives, but it's not so bad that they cannot live independently. So they're able to compensate for the problem. But it does put them at risk for the other more serious conditions. In fact, people with MCI have a 10% risk of getting Alzheimer's dementia each year. So what the FDA recommended is that we recruit 180 people with MCI, and that 90 of them would have what we call suspected Alzheimer's dementia, or Alzheimer's disease, I should say. Because dementia means that their cognitive impairment interferes with their independence. So 90 would not have a history of head trauma. We think they're on the road to develop Alzheimer's dementia. Another 90 have had a history of head trauma, and we suspect that they're going to go on to get chronic traumatic encephalopathy. All the subjects will get FDDNP-PET scans at baseline. They'll get MRI scans, and they'll get a clinical evaluation and neuropsychological evaluations. It's just document they have MCI to see where they are at baseline. Now, this is a protocol that's been approved by the FDA, and it's called a request to charge protocol. Right now, there's no NIH funding for this protocol, and the FDA feels that there's research that's so important for public health. They put in an approval process where they allow people to pay for their own scans. Okay? So the only thing that the people who enroll in the study will need to pay for will be for their PET scan. We know that so many people who have suspected CTE, they've lined up, they're ready to sign up for this study because they have nothing else and they want to know what's going on. So we have plenty of people who want to do that. For those who haven't had a history of head trauma, they're not so lined up to do that. And we're going to need some funding to help pay for those scans for people who can't afford it, or who want to enroll and are not have the capacity or are not willing to pay for their scans. But the beauty of the design of the study is everything else will be paid for pretty much from their insurance companies. Because if you have MCI, if you have mild cognitive impairment, insurance companies, including Medicare, will pay for the MRI scan. They'll pay for the clinical evaluation. They'll pay for the neuropsychological evaluation. So that's the baseline assessment. And then what we'll do is we'll repeat the clinical and neuropsychological evaluations after 1 and 2 years to see if the baseline PET scan predicts where people go. And insurance companies will pay for that as well. So the other areas where we need some funding, in addition to the PET scans for those who can't afford it, would be for APOE genetic testing, because we think it is an important research test. It's not very expensive, but we still need, that comes outside the purview of insurance companies. But we also need a research assistant to help us coordinate this, to keep everything. So that's basically the pitch I have to make. And I'm appealing to our friends who's supporting the Longevity Center. I think this is a very important study. I'm hoping you can find it within yourselves to visit us on our website, UCLA Longevity Center, and there's a link to support. No donation will be turned away. If we can get, it's not an expensive investment at this point. We need maybe $150,000 to get this thing started, because so much is going to be paid for by the insurance, and also those people at risk for CTE who are very eager to pay for the scans themselves. These people want to know what's going on in the brain. Let me tell you another aspect of this study, which I think is quite important. I've been involved in PET research for many years. In 2004, we went to an organization called CMS. It's called Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And that's the policymakers that make decisions about what Medicare will pay for. And we had done a lot of research with this other kind of PET scan called FDG. And we showed them our studies, and they were very, very, very compelling. We didn't have a telemarketer. What we convinced them to have Medicare pay for those PET scans, because we showed that those scans could differentiate Alzheimer's disease from another form of dementia called frontal temporal dementia. And the reason that CMS agreed to it is they saw practical utility for patients and families as a result. And the reason is that frontal temporal dementia does not respond well to the current medicines for Alzheimer's disease. And so this particular scan differentiated those two conditions. And that was valuable to find out who should go on what medicine and who should not. Here we have a similar argument that if we can move FDDNP-PET forward, we will be able to get people with MCI in the direction of proper treatments for Alzheimer's disease, which are already available. And in fact, there may be disease-modifying treatments down the pike. CTE is not at that stage right now. We need to get those patients into clinical trials. And what's so key about this is MCI, if you've heard my other talks, it's about early detection and prevention. if we can find out what's going on when people have MCI before it goes on to dementia, it's going to be easier to protect a healthy brain rather than try to repair damage once that damage is extensive. So that's, I think that's the end of my presentation. Linda, do you want to come back on the screen and we can have a bit of a conversation and look at some of the questions?
Yeah, we've had quite a few questions. We've had some problems with your audio. It's been kind of fuzzy.
Oh, okay. Well,
so I don't know, but we'll try.
Hopefully, could you hear some of it or just not any of it?
Yes, just a little. I think I would like to highlight a few important things just for those who maybe
please
hear things. So we're really looking at a study that is going to help differentiate between Alzheimer's disease and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And the reason that we are very interested in the FDDNP study is that we've done some preliminary research in this area. And in our studies, we have found in smaller samples that we are able to differentiate the two. But in order to really make this technology more available to the public, need to look at this in a larger number of individuals. The take-home message too about FDDNP, why it's so important, is that it looks at both tau and amyloid. So someone in our questions asked, does amyloid imaging, just amyloid imaging, differentiate between Alzheimer's disease, MCI, and I think it was normal cognition? And Gary, I think that would be good for you to address that, especially to highlight the uniqueness of FDDNP.
Well, what's unique about it, it's the only PET imaging tool that images both amyloid and tau. And our studies are very consistent that we see a pattern early on and that we can predict what's going to happen. This is why the FDA was so excited about this study.
Yeah.
And originally when we went to them, we said, well, let's just look at CT. They said, oh, no, this is going to be important for Alzheimer's as well. And that's where we came up with this design.
And I can tell you clinically, because I do the neurocognitive testing on patients with Alzheimer's or suspected Alzheimer's disease. That's part of my job, is to help with that differential diagnosis. Many of them also have MCI, is that a number of people have histories of head injury, either through sports. We've seen, boxers and football players, and we see people who've had multiple concussions. And this does come up is, what are we really looking at here? And because it matters in your recommendations for treatment and in the type of diagnosis, right? The differential diagnosis that you're making. So I just had a very similar question come up about a month ago with the patient. So the difficulty is, like, I felt like, okay, this is a case for an FDDNP scan, but again, they're not available clinically. And this is, was a concrete example of why it's important for these types of scans to be available. So we've come a long way in with the FDA, like Dr. Small says, they're highly interested, but we would like to be able to overcome some shortfalls in the funding, and that's really for the research assistant and to pay for the scans, so that people who can't afford them can be part of the study. And so those, I think, there's one other very important highlight that I wanted to reiterate is when Dr. Small was talking about the location of the protein deposits. So if you looked at those scans, you saw that there was that triangle of uptake of of the tracer, which means that those are areas with a lot of neuropathology. And those areas, what really makes a difference is that these are in areas like the amygdala in CTE that's responsible for emotional regulation, part of those circuits. Also in deep brain areas that are very important for, among other things, for movement and for communicating neuronally through connections with movement. And what you see in CTE is a lot of mood changes. And we've heard about many of former athletes who become depressed, who've developed motor disorders. And that's part of the difference that you're seeing, why location is so important, because it has to do theoretically with the symptomology and the connectivity or disconnectivity that results in the brain that affects mood, motor movements, and also cognition. So I just wanted to put that out there.
You know, I'm looking at, Linda, I'm looking at some of the
questions. Yeah.
And one person asked, how do we sign up to volunteer if we fit study criteria? Well, I'm going to say they should actually email you to the Longevity Center.
Sure.
Because you're one of the investigators on that study. Although Helen Bretsky, who we all know, I think will be taking over my role as a principal investigator since I moved to another health system. Another question is APOE4 test widely available? It is available. And actually, if you get one of these commercial tests like 23andMe, you can get your APOE4 test. But you can't get, you have to go to a licensed clinical laboratory to get that test. I don't generally recommend it as a predictive test. We tend to use it in our research at this point because it's neither necessary nor sufficient to predict Alzheimer's disease. So somebody's asking, can you please describe the PET scan procedure, contrast radiation? The procedure is fairly straightforward. You sit and you get an injection of a radioactively labeled small chemical marker. The amount of radiation that you're exposed to is less than a chest X-ray. We also keep track of that. We don't want people to get too much radiation. After the injection, the radiation, radiated chemical is taken up by the brain. You sit for about a half hour. You go into the scanner for about a half hour, and that's it. And minimal side effects. Occasion people will get a little bruising at the injection site. It's extremely well tolerated. Somebody asked about the status of the p-tau217 blood test for Alzheimer's. You know, there are a lot of other tests, and I hope one day we'll have a blood test. It's something that's less expensive. But right now, you know, the advantage of this PET scan technology is a window into the brain. You can really not only see levels of the proteins, but the location of the proteins in the brain. The question, does amyloid PET differentiate between Alzheimer's, MCI, and normal aging? Well, you know, it really doesn't, but it does show you a buildup over time. You know, those are terms, Alzheimer's, dementia, MCI, and normal aging, are really defined by the tools you've worked with, Linda, and that's neuropsychological testing. Those are really clinical definitions. So sometimes you can see amyloid and tau in the brain of someone with normal aging, but they're functionally independent. They have a lot of cognitive reserve. So the PET scan at this point doesn't really differentiate those factors. Somebody also asked about genetic factors for Alzheimer's. I mean, I mentioned APOE4. This is a genetic risk. It's a form of a gene that is common in the population. It's called apolipoprotein E. comes in 3 different forms. 20% of the population has APOE4. It increases your risk for Alzheimer's. But some people with it never get it. So again, it's not a good predictive test. In less than 1% of cases, you see genetic mutations that actually cause the disease. The APP mutation, presenilin mutations. And these will cause the disease, but they're quite rare, and it's usually in early onset families where 50% of relatives get the disease.
So Gary, what about APOE4 and a risk for CTE? That's come up.
Yeah, so that I don't know, but I do know that APOE4 with head trauma does increase your risk.
Right. Yeah. Maybe it would be helpful to talk a little bit about the type of insults to the brain that can contribute to CTE. We had Sharon, who I know, asked about domestic violence, and there are some reports that chronic trauma to the brain, including domestic violence, is potentially a risk for developing long-term damage in cognition, and that could include CTE as well. But I think for the people who are out there to say, I've been in a car accident, what types of things do the histories look like of people who develop CTE?
It could be any kind of traumatic brain injury. It could be from domestic violence. I mentioned football, any kind of sports, whether the contact sports, soccer, or anything. Car accidents, I mentioned falls. All these forms of head trauma can contribute. But I think people also should remember that our brains are protected by the skull. And so just because you have a concussion, or just because you hit your head, doesn't mean it's the end of the world. And a lot of the lifestyle strategies that we've been studying and that we advocate at the Longevity Center are important for everyone. Even though we don't have a specific treatment for CTE, exercise when people are feeling better after the concussion, rest, stress management, all those strategies are very important. I see another question I think is important. Somebody's asking, are donations tax deductible? And the short answer is yes.
Okay, so
another question.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Gary.
What does testing enable to be done to help with detection if condition occurs? Well, as I mentioned earlier, if we can detect CTE early, then we can get those people with MCI into clinical trials, so we can find out what works early on. And we can also get those people with Alzheimer's into the proper treatments. So here's somebody that says, I'm 70. If I wanted to be tested, is it possible? What is the cost? Well, if you're 70 and you have mild cognitive impairment, you could be tested. The cost of the scan is approximately a few $1,000s. So it's not that much. It is a research scan. Once it gets approved, it will probably be less, and insurance companies will pay for it.
Right. Somebody asked, how do we sign up to volunteer if we fit the study criteria? And once the study, there are consent forms. So what happens is the study is advertised, and then you're consented and told about the details of the study. And that's, how people actually sign up to participate. But just to like, we were saying, you can send, your information for when we do start the study if you're interested. But you will go through a consenting process, and be fully informed about the study, and you put your John or Jane Hancock on there, and you've signed up for the study.
Well, what I would say though, you know, we've been studying this for a number of years, and we've got hundreds of people who've emailed us, who've called us. We have a long list of interested people, and I would say if you're interested, email Dr. Ercoli.
Yeah.
And we'll pass that on to the research assistant. We'll
Exactly.
sort through the list. And so we'll reach out to you once we get the study started. It's very close to getting started. We've got all the approvals. It's gone through all the committees. We just need some more money to hire a research assistant to get this going. So, Linda, I think we covered a lot of, did we miss any of the major questions? Really touch it. I know the hour is running late here.
Somebody asked us how much money are we trying to raise? And
I would say 150,000 to get started.
Yeah. And here, this is
a lot of money from
somebody shared something rather tragic, but this is what we've seen over and over again with CTE is that that they talked about their son-in-law was 55 years old and he took his life, and that his in-laws believe and his family believe that he had CTE. And this is a scenario that we've heard this happen in athletes, right? But in professional athletes after they retire, but it can happen in anyone. So
that's happened many times, and some of the most notable cases have been in athletes who committed suicide.
Mhm.
And you know what happens when that amygdala is shaken around, the emotional control center, people become unstable, they become irrational, and they become suicidal and they become dangerous. So this is a critically important problem. And many of us, I know that my colleague Bennett Malo thinks that there are a lot of unrecognized cases
Mhm.
of CT. There's a lot of overlap with post-traumatic stress disorder in military personnel, where the thought is, and this could be another application, next study down the line, a lot of these people with PTSD have suicidal thinking and so forth. And some of that may not be just due to psychological stress, but from the head trauma they experienced from last injuries.
Right. There are a lot of changes in the brain that are associated with the insults, right? Not only do you have changes, somebody asked, does head trauma leave a mark? Well, it can leave a physical mark and contusions on the brain, but it leaves other kinds of marks like neuronal damage and changes in cellular permeability and chemical changes that are part of the neurodegenerative process. So the thing is, we've not been able to see those marks. I mean, if you get if you get a brain scan after an injury, sometimes you see damage, but it's not always obvious. So the changes in the brain are, not just physical, but chemical as well. It just disrupts the brain function.
So I'm seeing a couple other notes here. One, ACTS will make a donation. Thank you. Linda,
Thank you.
the notice to you, please send the link when time permits. That's from Sharon. And also, Leslie Treff asked, can you tell us where to send the donations? Just search online for UCLA Longevity Center and go to the link that says donations, and you can do it directly online.
Right, and
very appreciative.
Thank you to Sharon with ACTS, which we're working together. They are a community-based support group for people with caregiving for people with Alzheimer's disease. So they certainly understand the need for this kind of work. So Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. So here's one if you're over 65, I don't know if there's myocardial impairment. Both parents died of Alzheimer's already. Well, I would, come in and get tested. I mean, we have wonderful clinicians at the geriatric psychiatry division and the longevity center, and that's the best way to find out. So, Linda, I see that the hour is nearing an end. So I'm going to sign out here from New Jersey. This has been a delight to join you on this webinar. I really appreciate all of you out there in the audience for joining us, and those of you who already have supported this important study. Just to let you know, even though I've got more responsibilities out here in the East Coast, as of November 1st, I will be an emeritus professor at UCLA. And if my New Jersey health system allows me to, I will go on recall at UCLA to continue some of the studies that we're doing at UCLA that are so important, including some of the brain imaging studies that are multi-site, as well as the curriculum study that we've been able to get funding for to do a multi-site follow-up. So on that note, thank you all.
Thank you, Gary.
For your help and support.
Really great.
Linda?
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Take care.
Really
Be well, everybody.
appreciate
Stay safe.
Well,
Stay
but
safe.
I'll see you. We'll see you on the airwaves.
Okay.
All right. And
Sounds
thank
good.
you, everyone, for your support and for attending this webinar. It's great to see the big response that we had. And take care and be well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.